Tonight on Nation to Nation, remembering Colten Boushie. 4 years after his killer was acquitted, family and advocates push for change.
Fortunately, Indigenous people are still subject to disproportionately high levels of violence at the hands of non-Indigenous people.
Canada's prison watchdog calls for action as Indigenous incarceration rates hit alarming highs and conditions behind bars hit troubling lows.
This is nothing short of human rights violation and something the government should do everything they can to try to remedy.
And a minister's pledge to root out systemic racism in the public service hasn't stopped a class action lawsuit from being filed.
I don't think that systemic racism is even understood at the federal government level. If it was, I don't think this lawsuit would have ever been launched.
Hello, I'm Brett Forster, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Many may not remember the date, February 9th, 2018, but on that day a jury found Gerald Stanley not guilty in the shooting death of Colten Boushie. 4 years later, Dr. Tasha Hubbard and Dr. Gina Starblanket put out a series of booklets to help others navigate similar circumstances. It's called Tools for Indigenous Family Survivors of Violence, and to explain what that title means, we're joined by Dr. Starblanket. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thanks, Brett. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So you could have picked any day to release this. Why did you choose this particular anniversary to make the toolkit public?
Well, this year marks 4 years since the all-white jury acquitted Gerald Stanley for the death and murder of Colten Boushie. And 4 years is a significant anniversary. It's a significant time period culturally for our people, and it felt like the right opportunity to and the right period in time to provide these sorts of tools that unfortunately continue to be necessary for many of our relatives and many of our communities.
Well, on that note, how would you describe what these booklets can do for these families?
Well, the idea behind the booklets really came from Jade Tutusis and the Boushie family because they wanted to generously share their own experience and lessons learned. It's, again, very sad that they had to learn these lessons the way they did, but they are so generous in their advocacy and in trying to ensure that other people don't have to share in those same experiences that they did following the death of their loved one. And so the idea was that we would provide tools and supports and resources that were geared towards Indigenous victims of violence and their families.
One of these booklets describes what to do if I come knocking to ask questions or somebody else in the media does. So perhaps can you shine some light on why that's important?
Yeah, I think the media is a really important instrument, for being able to distribute a message and share information with many of our loved ones and communities. But it's not always our friend, particularly in times of loss and grief. And I think that this was certainly something that Jade and the family learned through the process of dealing with the media, and they learned how to advocate for themselves within those situations, how to ensure that they were being protected when they were engaging with media, so as not to just find themselves sort of exploited in the name of a good story or something like that. And so the idea was how to responsibly work with the media and also work in a way where you're ensuring and honoring that need to care for yourself in a time of grief.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps there's a lesson there for us in the press too, to learn about how we approach these traumatic situations. But another booklet is called Know Your Rights as a Victim. Is this possibly the most important thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think from the outset of this, of the death of Colten, he and the other youth who were present that day and his family were treated like criminals. And I think the idea behind this book is to really be able to provide people with the tools to know their rights, to not be taken advantage of, to not be abused by the police and by institutions that they had to deal with following the death of their loved one. And so this is a way to just, provide that sort of foundational knowledge around what your rights are when you're faced with that sort of situation.
Another important one is named police interactions. But let's say I'm the family member of the victim. So why would I need to know about the police?
Why would you need to know about the police? Because the police are going to be interacting. They were interacting with the family from, a fairly short period following Colton's death, but then also throughout, the aftermath, throughout the trial, there's going to be, various scales and levels of engagement with local authorities and regional authorities, particularly in a small rural environment where you're going to be, you're going to have occasions to interact with those authorities on a regular basis. And so I think it's important to get in those interactions to know your rights so that you could advocate for those rights that belong to you, but that the police might not be telling you about, right? You actually have the right to X, Y, Z. And so this was a way of sort of laying that out and allowing people or facilitating the process for people to be able to protect and advocate for themselves when dealing with the police.
And the RCMP civilian watchdog recently ruled that the Mounties racially discriminated against the Boushie family. So is that something to be concerned about too?
Absolutely. Yeah, particularly in a climate like, a rural prairie, northern Saskatchewan environment. We absolutely know race relations are fraught in those spaces. And I think there's a reason that the Boushie family argued for an out-of-province trial. They ended up, look at the constitution of the jury. It was an all-white jury from the Battlefords Regional District. I think, there was a sense early on that even though race wasn't mentioned at all in the trial, there was heavily coded language and heavily racialized ideas and narratives that were circulating throughout.
And finally, it strikes me as kind of a sad commentary that even something like this is needed in society. So perhaps can you reflect a little bit on how far the country has come in the last 4 years?
Yeah, I think that these resources, again, unfortunately, are still incredibly necessary, these sorts of resources. We certainly haven't seen the levels of political transformation that we would like to see. We haven't seen the levels of social transformation that I know many would like to see. And so these, unfortunately, Indigenous people are still subject to disproportionately high levels of violence at the hands of non-Indigenous people. And so these are resources that continue to be necessary.
All right, Dr. Gina Starblanket joining us from Victoria, BC. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Brett.
After the break, correctional investigator Ivan Zinger will be here. He'll tell us if things have gotten better for Indigenous inmates. Welcome back. Every year, the rate of Indigenous people locked up in federal penitentiaries rises. Every year, correctional investigator Ivan Zinger sounds the alarm a little bit louder, and sadly, every year his call for action seems to go unheeded. Dr. Zinger released his latest annual report this morning, and he joins me now to break it down. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Hello, Brett. Good to be here.
It's great to have you on. Dr. Zinger, you found not only are Indigenous people more likely to be imprisoned, they're also more likely to have force used against them on the inside. How did we get to this point?
Yeah, well, we've reported, as you mentioned, year after year that the correctional outcomes for Indigenous incarcerated people at the federal level are very poor. They tend to be released later in their sentences than non-Indigenous people. They tend to be in higher classification institution. They tend to be the target of use of force more often. They're also more likely to be placed in segregation, or what are now called structured intervention units. They're more likely to have their parole revoked and sent back to penitentiaries than non-Indigenous offenders. So this is yet another issue that we looked a little bit more closely, and we were pretty saddened and distressed by our findings.
You called it deeply troubling in your press release. Do you think this has become a human rights crisis, or is that too severe a way to frame things?
Absolutely, it is a human rights crisis. So when we have, for example, now about 32% of the federal prison population are from Indigenous background, that is very, very problematic when we know they represent less than 5%. And it's even more acute for women, who now represent, as of this week, 49% of all federally sentenced women are Indigenous. This is nothing short of human rights violation, and something the government should do everything they can to try to remedy.
As a follow-up, we have been in the reconciliation era for nearly 7 years, so why haven't things improved on this front?
It's a good question, and certainly this is a long-standing issue. For the last 30 years, the incarceration rate has gone up year after year, independently of the government in power. And no government so far has been able to stop that trend, or even do better, which is to reverse it. So despite many investments, many initiatives, I think we are still struggling with how to address it appropriately.
It kind of sounds like the political will is missing in that case. And so what would it take to finally get some action?
I'm not so sure that it's the political will that is really to blame. Perhaps, but I would say that Correctional Service of Canada has been very defensive and not endorsed deep-rooted reforms that are needed to change the course of action. So I think the bureaucracy has to also carry a lot of the responsibility for the situation we're in. This is why the kinds of recommendations that are required must be bold, not simply tweaks or more funding. That's not going to resolve the situation, but we seriously need to do the business of corrections differently in this country.
Yes, if the bureaucracy can't change itself, it would fall to the minister to change it. On that front, Justice Canada, hopes to address this by repealing some mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Do you think that would help reverse the trend?
I support that initiative. I think mandatory minimum penalties are bad public policy. But I don't think that this is going to be the panacea that is actually going to move the yardstick very much. We have to remember that most of those mandatory minimum penalty were enacted during the Harper years, during the decade of Harper government. And everybody feared at that time that this would lead to mass incarceration. But that did not happen because I think there was some restraints. The mandatory minimum that were egregious were struck down by the courts and as deemed unconstitutional. And I think some restraints were shown by police, by prosecutors, by the courts to sort of circumvent those mandatory minimum penalties. I would say even that many of those mandatory minimum penalty basically match the previous sentences that a typical offender or accused would receive in the same circumstances. But so, for example, if they enacted a new mandatory minimum that was harsher because a weapon was used, the previous sentencing scheme would, in any event, provide about the same sentence using aggravated circumstances to basically harden the sentence. So
Okay, Dr. Zinger, thanks for your tenacity and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Brett.
Coming up, rumble over racism in the federal civil service continues. We'll have an update for you on that after a short break. Welcome back. Last spring, systemic racism in Canada was under the microscope, including at the two federal departments governing Indigenous affairs. Indigenous staff were beginning to break their silence, and now the employees have started a class action lawsuit against the feds. One person who first spoke out was Letitia Wells. She is a former employee at Indian Oil and Gas Canada and now one of two lead plaintiffs. She joins the show from Calgary. Miss Wells, welcome to Nation.
Thank you.
First off, what have these last 10 months been like for you since you first went public?
They've been life-changing, completely life-changing with the response of individuals across Canada that have stepped forth. The lawsuit is growing. It's growing every day, every month. I think in moving forward, it's moving beyond the fear of reprisal. There is still a huge set of fear within Indigenous employees existing. And the ones that have come forth to give us their stories that are not no longer employees of the federal government, I've gotten feedback on them that they're becoming very angry. Their fear has turned into anger.
All right, I'd like to ask about this class action. It proposes to represent all current or former Indigenous staff who experienced racism while working for these departments. Why did you decide to file that case?
I personally decided to file this case because it wasn't only me that had been harmed by the federal government. After coming out in the stories that I received across Canada, there is an injustice here against Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women. We have rights, we have access to the same resources and grievance processes that others do, but we're not treated as equal. And so the plaintiffs that have stepped forward currently, a lot of people are angry. A lot of people are moving forward in faith in the Canadian justice system. We're cautiously optimistic about it.
How has the government responded? Has there been any talk of settling, or is this looking like it may be a battle?
I know the last update I got from my lawyer was we are currently trying to get certification in the class law action suit. We currently have forwarded 15 more files to be reviewed in the patterns that have been developed in systemic racism. And so I hope that the government does take us serious. I hope that this process is not delayed, denied, and distracted here, which I feel that it is. It's a slow process, and I understand how slow it is. And I do have a lot of faith in our current legal team that we will be heard. And this, I believe we have enough evidence to move forward for the classification or the certification, sorry.
Well, it is a slow process, but there has been some movement. Recently, a third-party probe at Indian Oil and Gas Canada found examples of racism, harassment, and other quote-unquote unacceptable behaviors. What's your reaction to a finding like that at your former workplace?
Okay, the report that I had reviewed, or I've gotten some kind of summary on it, it had 6 themes on it, and I think it is a report that came in from a third-party consultant, TLS, that was hired to investigate the racism. I haven't seen the report myself, but I do know that 6 themes were developed. And my thoughts on this report is I am cautiously optimistic about the changes that have been recommended. There are 70, as I understand it, there are 78 recommendations. I am not sure that they will be implemented. I'm cautiously optimistic about that because the government has a long history of producing final reports and these reports becoming shelved. For example, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry was finalized in June of 2001. And in moving forward, we're now into 2021. And if you look at that report, in essence, it's got the same themes and patterns regarding systemic racism as this TLS report does today. And if you wanted to even go further into that, we can measure it to the MMIWG and the TRC. So again, I'm cautiously optimistic about this report, and I'm not sure it's enough to make the changes that need to be made in order to provide the safety that Indigenous people need.
Last year, after you and other employees stepped forward, the ministers told us there would be a thorough review internally following these allegations. Now they say an action plan is being drawn up, which would apply across the departments once finished. How optimistic are you that sort of thing will be effective at changing things?
I'm cautiously optimistic that the federal government has our best interests in the truth depths of their heart to keep us safe. I don't think that systemic racism is even understood at the federal government level. If it was, I don't think this lawsuit would have ever been launched. I think that in order for something like this to change, it has to change in the heart of its constitution and in the heart of laws. That is where change is made, is when policies are changed and laws are enforced. I think because of the history of existing reports that the government has produced, that has not proven to give us change. Like Canada doesn't even understand reconciliation. And as an example of the TRC, reconciliation was meant to help people understand the trauma of Indigenous people as a result of the residential schools. But today, reconciliation is becoming marketable. It's in demand, and there's a huge influx of dollars for this. And all of a sudden, we have non-natives once again running these departments and these dollars going to them. And in order to fix this, you need authentic Indigenous leadership to make that change.
Well, your case hasn't been certified yet, as you said earlier, but if it is, how many people do you think could be included based on what you've heard so far?
I think that we can get into maybe in the thousands, honestly. I think that there is a huge fear of reprisal right now, but I think once we hit classification that number will increase because there are other lawsuits currently against the federal government. I think there might be 5, 6 in total, including us, with systemic racism in the same patterns and themes of what we have developed. Discrimination, no promotions, harassments, we don't have access to the grievance processes that regular people do.
All right, we do have to leave it there. Ms. Wells, I want to thank you for your time and thanks for the update.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for this episode of Nation to Nation. If you'd like to watch our past interview on this topic, go to aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. We'll be back next week with more political coverage. I'm Brett Forster, and thanks for watching.